in at the end of this. We'll make sure that Aaron pulls all those questions together, and we'll get some of our experts to answer those. I'll actually let the speakers introduce themselves as they move forward. I do want to pass it on a little bit to Neil to talk a little bit about what's going on with the University of Minnesota. They're dealing probably with the same challenges as a lot of school districts are, but they're probably a little ahead of the game in putting some programs together. So Neil, just a quick overview before we pass it on to Pat Overham.
Thanks, Arif. The major pieces that we've been focusing on, I would say with the past month and a half or 2 months, is we've been looking at ventilation issues associated with trying to figure out where we can have classrooms, where we can have people working in lunchroom areas. And the ventilation issue, we're focusing primarily on identifying areas that we have very poor ventilation, and can we modify those spaces by adding increased filtration, or should we just not have people in those spaces? And then looking to see if we can upgrade some other spaces so that we can have some adequate ventilation, and making sure the filters are all in place, that the air is circulating the way it should be. The other pieces that we're looking at is the functional use of some spaces like cafeterias, etc. Looking at having one chair per table, things like that, and then also using a lot of spaces and figuring out setting up as many barriers as we can where those will work. It's going to be a difficult start. I'd say the university, the way I can see it, is going to be going primarily hybrid. Going in, there'll be some spots where they're going to be doing some in-person teaching, and there'll be a lot of them where they're doing a hybrid learning system or online. And it's very much based on what is being taught and what needs to be conveyed. So if you have to have people close together, we're still working on it, trying to figure out how we can get the best type of mask possible and not take it away from healthcare workers so people can interface. The last piece that I think all districts are going to be working with is you need to have a plan. So let's say you have a COVID positive patient and they've been in a place and they've been coughing. How long before you can get back into that space? What type of cleaning do you do? Those are some really important facilities issues that you want to address. Anything else, Arif?
I think that's helpful. I think that'll be very helpful, and I think it'll kind of tie into some of the things that Pat Overham and his team is going to talk about. Just again, at the end of it, if you have any questions, put it in the chat, and we'll make sure we get all of those answered. With that, let me pass it on to Pat to kick this off, Pat. Thanks. I think you're on mute, Pat.
Look at that. I'll figure that out about month 5 into COVID, and then we'll be good. Anyway, thanks. Good morning. I'm Pat Overham. I'm one of the principals at ICS. And as Arif mentioned, what we want to do is try to give you some information today related to the things that we've been researching and exploring and helping districts that we work with implement related to kind of reorganizing their physical space and some of the infrastructure modifications that we've been seeing districts use. So go ahead, Aaron. We'll let both Chris and Dana kind of introduce themselves once they get to the point where they're speaking, but we're happy to have both Chris and Dana as part of the team here at ICS. Both bring, you know, literally decades of experience in K-12 and in design and facilities infrastructure. So hopefully we can provide some value for you today as we go through things. The hope is that we'll run through the information in the presentation. We'd really like to get to questions and answers and potential discussion and leave things as informal as possible as we move forward. Go ahead, Aaron. Just as a quick introduction, and for those of you who were at the first session, you probably heard me overemphasize this a few times, but you know, there's no doubt all of us are going to be really needing to rethink how we're operating our facilities and using our facilities. As Neil mentioned, it's, you know, examining different spaces and what we have and making the best we can out of the spaces and the facilities we have. from a COVID standpoint, we're really going to have to rethink things. Because of the unique situations in every district, we want to make sure that everyone really notes that any of these operational changes are going to result in impacts, right? Whether it's staffing or financial or educational impacts. And it's for that reason that we really want, you know, we're going to be throwing a lot of stuff at you here in the next 20 minutes. We want to really encourage you to focus on each of those recommendations or considerations individually and evaluate it uniquely for your situation to see if it's something that's worth implementing in your case or not. So we just wanted to start with that. So just a few general recommendations here really quickly. I'm betting a lot of you are ahead of us with some of these, but installing hand sanitation stations in each classroom, or at least in high traffic areas or distributed throughout the buildings so that it's readily accessible. I believe Jeff Schultz mentioned in one of our earlier sessions, that's something that isn't going to be available likely or readily available here at the end of August. So for those of you who haven't considered ordering those supplies, it's something to jump on sooner than later. We've seen a lot of districts start to remove soft seating from their buildings or anything that they're deeming not very easy to clean and disinfect. Again, that's something you're going to have to evaluate on a case-by-case basis, but certainly removal of some of the soft seating areas will not only potentially provide additional capacity within your buildings, but it'll enable you to remove those areas that might not be as easy from a disinfection standpoint. We've seen districts look at transitioning to more hard surface when it comes to interior finishes, whether they're looking at flooring or wall surfaces or even ceiling finishes. Again, can be certainly be a high cost to do that in general throughout your facilities, but even if you come up with a plan to get there little by little or to treat specific areas that may be worse off than others at this point, getting ready for cleanable and cleanability and disinfection of those spaces. Considering replacement or transition to touchless towel dispensers, paper dispensers, faucets and flush valves within your bathrooms. Many of you, over the years, I'm sure have gone to touchless faucets and so on. This is even more encouragement to consider some of those replacements at this time as well. We've seen a number of districts decide to discontinue student lockers, at least temporarily getting into the school year, asking students to keep things self-contained in their own bags. Clearly, that's a district by district decision, right? We run into a lot of the districts we work with who have backpack policies, and some allow students to carry backpacks into classrooms, some don't. But any of those either shared storage areas and athletic or activity lockers or student lockers are things that districts are considering at least temporarily discontinuing use of. Chris, do you want to get into some of the space related recommendations or considerations?
Sure, thanks, Pat. For all of you who don't know me, I'm Chris Seamer, project director at ICS. On the implementation side, focusing on pre-construction and design. Again, just continuing with general recommendations and things to consider. First one, consider canceling or modifying classes where students are likely to be in very close contact, such as gym, choir, and music. Utilizing outdoor spaces as weather permits. Obviously, we live in a cold climate, so some of this is going to be somewhat of a challenge for the choir and music variety of classes, but there may be creative ways to do gym outside as the weather permits throughout the year, and minimizing close contact and contact sports, those kinds of things. Consider discontinuing use of communal use in shared spaces such as cafeterias and playgrounds with shared playground equipment. Again, utilizing the playground area, but maybe just not using the playground equipment to, again, discourage close contact where possible. Consider canceling field trips, assemblies, and other large gatherings. Consider canceling or limiting cross-school transfers for special programs such as academic clubs, activity, athletics. As the governor, we near that those rollout of what the plan will be. I'm sure some clarity will come to the athletics and activities portions of this, but again, something we'll need to consider moving forward. Consider installation of UVC and HEPA filtration units in normally occupied spaces and or where insufficient ventilation systems exist. Dana and Pat will get into the ventilation portion more specifically, but again, areas where you have challenges, this may be a way to help filter the air and make sure you're gathering contaminants. The Department of Public Safety State Fire Marshal Division issued a memo or a booklet that helps determine 50% capacity of your buildings. It's actually fairly simple, and the 2 pages are shown there actually that they've issued. But it's based on the Minnesota State Building Code for occupancy. So just as an example, a 900 square foot classroom, you basically take the area that's occupiable. So any built-in casework needs to be subtracted, and then the wall-to-wall dimensions. You take that by your use occupancy. So let's say it's a classroom that's an occupant load of 20. That would give you 45 occupants potential for that space. As we all know, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to put 45 people in there, but this is an egress capacity calculation for the building. So then you divide that by your 50%, which gives you 22.5. They always say round up when you're doing these calculations, so that would give you an occupancy of 23 for that 900 square foot classroom. Again, its egress capacity will limit the number of occupants in most cases. So that would be the amount of exits for building and rooms. You can't exceed that, obviously, for fire code. So as long as you're staying within that, you can start doing that math throughout your buildings and determining how many occupants you can fit. Occupant loads recommend the calculation of each space in the building, as I mentioned, but they are different. So as I mentioned, a classroom has an occupant load of 20. Like a shop or vocational space has an occupant load of 50. So there's different factors for all of these spaces, and they may give you flexibility in terms of figuring out how to maximize the amount of students you can get into a space. Again, gyms, cafeterias, those also have higher occupancy loads. So again, maybe a way to do that. And then gross floor area versus net floor area. You're using the net floor area, so the actual occupiable space in the room. So again, wall-to-wall dimension, and then subtract anything that would be considered like built-in casework, things that are protruding into the space that you cannot move, like furniture. Some additional recommendations that are in line with this then would be the next steps is rearranging student desks and tables to maximize space between students. So that 6 foot rule, or in the spirit of that, turning all the desks and tables in the same direction to considering an alternate grid so that student isn't breathing into the back of another student. Consider utilizing large spaces, as I mentioned, so gyms, student dining, the field houses, auditoriums, those kinds of spaces, so that you can maximize how many kids you're going to be able to get into the building. A lot of the ACT and SAT testing scenarios kind of give you an example of how this is done, as they have strict spacing in terms of how students can be spaced in those areas. Utilizing existing gym dividers, if they're available, to subdivide spaces better and manage class size or the type. Mark out the floor. We've all seen this in a lot of the stores, the grocery store or gas stations, whether it be directional or just the dots that maintain 6 foot spacing, just to encourage students to understand the circulation paths and how they're supposed to flow throughout the spaces. Create shields at groups of doors that separate entrances and exits, manage a one-way traffic in corridors as feasible, and further minimize contact. Again, where feasible, if you can do a one-way traffic flow that provides circulation throughout your building, that's obviously best, so you're not mixing cross-corridor traffic. But in those instances where you do have cross-core, putting up some kind of shield at those doors that separates and implies the correct direction that students are to be flowing. Some additional items: install physical barriers such as sneeze guards and partitions, particularly in areas where it's difficult for individuals to remain at least 6 feet apart at reception and administration areas. Create a transparent barrier, much like the transaction windows that are popping up at grocery stores and gas stations, that would allow the transfer of IDs to be passed underneath through a slot. Utilizing security intercom video to streamline the purpose as well. Place the visitor management system at a kiosk, so not necessarily relying on the staff member that's behind the desk to do this, but have a kiosk where you can direct visitors to slide their information and then they can be badged through that transaction window if needed. Place physical guides such as tape, again, the same idea as the grocery store and gas stations that we're seeing, the dots and the arrows cueing people to socially distance and same traffic patterns. In the classrooms, discourage sharing of items and educational objects that are difficult to clean and disinfect. Keep each child's belongings separate from others in individually labeled containers and cubbies. Common practice in elementary schools, but if that instance occurs in the higher grades, maybe something to consider. Ensure adequate supplies to minimize sharing of high touch materials to the extent possible. So again, just each student's items are in their own cubby or own space and they're not sharing whenever possible. Avoid sharing electronic devices, toys, books, other games as well. Food service. Consider having bring your own meals as a feasibility or serve individually plated meals. Down below, we also have prepackaged or bagged meals. Maybe that's a possibility as well, just to minimize the possibility of cross-contamination and just make it simple to have lunch. Install hand sanitizing stations, as Pat had noted, prior to going through lines and cafeteria use. Use disposable food service items. Again, some of these items are going to be a cost issue, but wherever possible, if you don't have to handle something that has to continually be washed and can just be disposed of, that may be something to consider in your district. Individuals should wash their hands after removing their gloves or directly handling food service items. And then if food, again, is offered at any event, having prepackaged or boxed or bagged lunches that can provide, separate items that others aren't touching. Occupant flow for arrival and dismissal. I noted a little bit of this just during the corridors, but as we know, arrival and dismissal of schools is really that high flow occupant of the corridors. So avoid mixing of students in common areas. Another example, allow students to eat lunch and breakfast in their classrooms to further that idea of just not mixing students, keeping them in their individual class groups. If you can't suspend the use of the commons area, try to limit it to the extent which students mix with each other. Restrict hallway use, again, trying to either staggered release or coming up with a circulation flow that works so you're minimizing the amount of cross-corridor traffic or the amount of students even in the corridor at one time. Try to avoid taking multiple classes to the bathroom at once. Coming up with some kind of schedule, is that feasible with some students in the younger grades? Possibly not. But again, just something to consider and figure out, how you're going to do that so you can minimize, again, that corridor traffic. Childcare or elementary school settings, consider staggered playground use. If you do choose to use the playground, rather than allowing multiple classes to play together. So, maybe you space 2 classrooms out over that area rather than the 4 that would typically go out there and they get their 15-minute slot and then you move on to the next group. And then again, stagger arrival and dismissal times. So The buses may be ready to go, but you only let X number of classrooms go, then the next group, and then followed by the next group to, again, minimize the amount of traffic in the corridors. Administrative office, which I noted a little bit for, and staff spaces. This specifically has to do with health and nurses office. For example, use the health office for child with flu-like symptoms and a satellite location for all of the other first aid or medication distribution, so that the nurse's office is really that if you're really sick, place to go for kids. The nurses area allowed build a containment room for a cot to isolate students that are exhibiting flu-like symptoms or running a high fever. Space doesn't allow, again, a conference room or a small classroom that maybe isn't being utilized can be used for that until the parent is allowed to come and pick that child up. And then limit non-essential visitors. So again, presence of volunteers and classroom activities, mystery readers, cafeteria sport, and other activities. To the extent possible, limit their involvement in the school day and entering the building. Pat?
Thanks, Chris. And I still can't get over, it's just completely ironic that we're teaching kids not to share and to stay away from each other and not collaborate, right? That's drives me crazy. Anyway, to get into some of the plumbing and water systems, and then last but not least, we'll spend quite a bit of time on HVAC. When it comes to plumbing though, and we mentioned this in one of the original sections, considering going to the touchless faucets and flush valves on plumbing fixtures. Again, anything we can do to reduce contaminants. Considering temporary discontinuation of using drinking fountains, especially ones that don't have the touchless bottle fillers or that are touchless in nature. And then considering adding temporary barricades where we can in gang bathrooms, maybe between sink stations or other places where that social distancing is difficult to accommodate. To get into HVAC, you know, we've really got a few highlights or goals when it comes to HVAC systems. First thing to note is obviously there are a lot of different types of systems within our buildings. They vary in complexity and flexibility and age, and you know, we've got, you can see many of you that are from districts we work with, and there are buildings that have systems that are brand new, and there are buildings that still have systems from 50 years ago. And so we're going to have to do what we can to really try to accomplish two things. We're going to try to increase outside air in order to try to dilute any airborne contaminants, and we're going to have to try to increase filtration and what we can to catch any airborne contaminants, and we're going to have to do that without compromising inside design temperature and relative humidity levels. So
Pat, just a quick comment here, if I can jump in. So maybe Neil can talk a little bit about this, because I think the reason ventilation is becoming more and more important is we've figured out, I think, or have a better understanding of what the transmission route is. And the fact that aerosolization seems to be one of the critical issues. So just maybe Neil, you can talk quickly, maybe 1 minute on, you know, why the ventilation issue and why we're finding more and more data that the infection rate is really more directly related to aerosolization.
I think what we're looking at least the data doesn't seem to show that in large ventilation systems, we're talking about recirculation. Now that may change, but that's the state of the data, like right at this moment. But the big piece that's helpful with ventilation is making sure that you have proper dilution of the air. And that's why they talked about if you don't have proper dilution with the amount of air that you're bringing into the space, then you might need to use some HEPA filtration. And the recent research we have on HEPA filtration, it's really important where you put that HEPA filtration if it's in the space. It should not be at the floor level because you're stirring things up. You should have the HEPA filter elevated off of the floor. So that's really important. The other part is with the ventilation, we don't want to create a high flow system, so we're pushing it in one direction. So we're taking it from one area, now we're trying to diffuse it to get an overall sense of dilution. The last piece that we're doing is we're disabling like demand control ventilation. so that where you have the amount of air is based on the amount of CO2 in the space. Some places may have that in the higher end. We're just running it all the time. And so disabling the carbon dioxide sensors. And I think his comment about making sure that things don't go south with respect to humidity control is really important, because we don't need a mold problem on top of what all the other things that we're dealing with.
Thanks, Neil.
Agreed. Aaron, go ahead to the next one. So as we look at it, we really try to break it down into three choices. When you look at any ventilation system, old or new, here's what we're up against. We can either modify and adjust how that current system is operating and being controlled. We can try to enhance that current system by either physically adding components or capabilities, whether it's additional filtration or what have you. Or we can supplement the operation of that system with a separate system or separate piece of equipment that serves the same space, right? So when you break it down, I'd encourage you to go system by system and determine, are we going to try to modify how this thing is operating on its own? Are we going to try to add something to it, or are we going to supplement it? When it comes down to it, those are really our three choices for any system. We've leaned pretty heavily on ASHRAE and some of their guidance and recent findings. You can see the link on the right-hand side of the slide. There is an absolute wealth of information related to how to treat different types of systems and what they're recommending for different ways to modify sequences of operations and so on, as Neil alluded to, and we'll get into it in a little bit of detail. If it is a dedicated outside air system, they've got a prescribed list of recommendations. If it's a VAV system, they've got a prescribed list of recommendations and so on. So we'd encourage you to lean pretty heavily on this as well when you're looking at your systems. Dana, do you want to try to jump into some of the background?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Dana Fontaine with the technical services team here at ICS. We're a team of engineers and technicians that focus on mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems. I want to talk a little bit today about just the state of facilities. I want to look at this through a different lens. If I'm a facilities person, a building operator, what's the state of my facility currently? And one of the ways, it's a trick of the trade, if you will, that we can quickly assess our air handling systems to see what the amount of outdoor air that we're bringing into a facility is. And the reason this is important is many of the facilities nowadays have building automation systems, and we can sit down and look at that and see, okay, the building automation system indicates that we're 20% outdoor air. But is that really the case? Because that 20%, that is just the signal that is being given to the control actuator or the motor that is controlling the outdoor air damper. And I don't want to get too technical in this, but a lot of recommissioning studies and assessments are performed, and one of the major things that is commonly found is problems with the outdoor air damper control. When there's a problem with the heating valve or a chill water or compressor, that's obvious immediately because of occupant discomfort. It isn't always so obvious when there's a problem with the outdoor air intake. So this is a quick calculation we wanted to put on the slide so building operations personnel can look at it, quickly assess their facility and determine, do we need to call our HVAC professional? Do we need to call our engineering professional and dig into this further? So, you know, there's a saying in the industry, the solution to pollution is dilution. And what we're looking at is at a minimum, let's make sure our systems are bringing in the outdoor air that it was designed to bring in, so we can avoid buildups of carbon dioxide, VOCs, and other things that studies have shown can make people tired, nauseous, and even weaken the immune system of people in the facility. So can we go to the next slide? So this this calculation is, and feel free to call us or your HVAC professional if you know facility staff want to take a run at this. But basically, most systems, the building automation system will give you this data. If not, you're going to have to manually do it. But you can see in this calculation, our return air temp is 80 degrees. Our mixed air temp is 55 degrees. So we take our return air minus our mixed air and divide that value by our return air minus our outdoor air. In this case, the calculation gives us 62.5% outdoor air. Well, what does that mean? Well, if you know the requirements of the outdoor air for your air handling system, it's usually on your design documents or past records in the facility. If it's a 10,000 CFM unit and it needs 50% outdoor air, that's 5,000 CFM, just to simplify that. If you come up with this calculation and it doesn't match what your building automation system is doing, it's time to call in somebody maybe to take a look at what's going on. The other calculation is if you actually want to set your outdoor air damper position, if you look at your design documents or your systems and you know that you need 50% outdoor air on your unit, that's a little trickier because there's some adjustments that need to be made. So on this particular unit, if we want, let's just say 50% outside air, we know that we need 50% return air in our system. So the calculation is our return air temperature, which is 80 degrees, times our percent of return air that we want, which is 50% damper. Multiply that as a decimal, that's 0.5. That gives us 40, and then our outdoor air temperature times the percent of outdoor air we want, which is 50. So that would give us a mixed air temperature of 60 degrees, meaning we need to adjust our dampers until we achieve a mixed air temperature of 60 degrees. That's a little more complicated. You might need to bring in your HVAC professional to take a look at that. But what I'm trying to say is this is something that can be quickly done to assess what your systems are doing in your building. Couple that with checking your filters to make sure they're clean, your fans are running, you're moving air. Obviously, systems nowadays are very complicated and there can be a lot more to this. But this is just to determine the state of the state, not arbitrarily increasing outdoor air randomly, because you need to look into that a little deeper through your HVAC professional or your professional engineer to see what, because it has effect on everything, your coil performance, your heating, your cooling, things like that. So.
Thanks, Dana. And just for those of you, one more quick comment related to that quick check formula. It's a simple way to do it based on temperatures. Probably best to do it when it's mild outside. If it was like it was last week, this calculation can get skewed a little bit based on humidity and moisture. But again, it's to be used as a quick check to give you a feel for where you're sitting on an outside air perspective. Go ahead, Aaron. So a few general recommendations related to your HVAC systems, and these are taken from ASHRAE as well. They're saying and they're recommending to really do an initial air flush for a couple of weeks prior to students re-entering the building. So if you can imagine, it's kind of intuitive and it makes sense, right? The building's been sitting for the summer, has had little use. They're really wanting you to just flush the heck out of it for a couple of years and freshen it up and make sure that we've gotten rid of as much of the airborne contaminant as we possibly can. They're also recommending that you set up your sequence of operations, or that you do what you can to try to do a daily air flush prior to people occupying the room, and whether that means from 5 until 7 in the morning or what have you, but to really ramp things up and flush out the building every morning before kids occupy the facility. And again, the second to the last bullet there, whether it's an existing air handling system or rooftop system or what have you, it's really trying to do what we can to maximize outside air without compromising temperature and humidity levels. And that's the delicate balance of trying to figure out how best to do it. Here's a quick note on dedicated outside air systems. ASHRAE is actually recommending that you increase your airflow to 150% of code minimum in an effort to try to increase dilution rates. A few other considerations, and I think the first one there, introduction of either a portable or electric HEPA or UV filter unit in each classroom would fall into my third category of supplementing a system, right? Whether you have standalone units, we've actually done that in many of our offices, is to add air purification units and HEPA filters distributed throughout the offices, and it's made a big difference from just an indoor air quality standpoint. ASHRAE is recommending that you consider operating your exhaust fans 24/7, and again that you're cranking up your makeup air, your outside air, in order to maintain a slightly positive pressure in the building. They're asking you to consider turning off your energy recovery wheels. We've had lengthy discussions internally on whether or not this is something we'd be comfortable recommending to our clients, and I would say that I would take it on a case-by-case basis, and this is one where I'd certainly recommend that somebody contacts their professional to get involved and determine and make sure that that's something that can be appropriately done without worrying about capacity of those systems and so on. Checking and fixing economizer dampers and controls. This is something Dana alluded to. We all work in schools, and every ventilation system in every building works perfectly, right? Not. I mean, we've gone into buildings that are absolutely perfect, and unfortunately, we've gone into buildings where dampers are held open with 2x4s or baling wire. And I think first things first is just a quick check of every system to make sure things are operating as closely to correct as possible as a first step. And that means trying to do what you can to get some of those real modest repairs completed on outside air controls in order to help things. Sequence of operations, actually in VAV systems, and Aaron, go ahead to the next page. VAV systems, they're actually suggesting to really ramp up the minimum airflow, especially when those are in full economizer mode. In essence, you are kind of taking away or limiting the VAV portion of the VAV system. In this case, it's in an effort to increase dilution. Installation of UVC filtration or ionization at the air handlers. This would fall into that category of enhancing an existing system by adding something. And considering areas like the nurses area or any other sensitive area within the building to make sure those ventilation systems are isolated and not circulated off of another system to the best that you possibly can. And again, I'll sound like a broken record, but I can't stress it enough. Obviously, ventilation systems are very, very finicky and complex, and we'd really suggest getting a hold of someone to help you analyze any of these tweaks or changes or modifications so that you don't lead to any issues that could be even worse. Arif?
Thanks, Pat. So just quick next steps, and then we'll open it up for the questions. I think we're getting quite a few from the chat. These PowerPoint slides, webinar recordings, and we have a wealth of information that we've gone through. So that's going to be, it's available on our website. We'll make sure we post this PowerPoint also on there. One of the things we've talked about specifically with the 3 school districts we're working with right now to do case studies and really help them go through this whole process is to probably have regular webinars where they will actually present exactly the steps they've taken, what challenges they're running into as they're reopening schools, what's going well, what's not, and so forth, because I think this issue is going to continue through the school year. It's not kind of one and done. I think there will be problems we're going to run into. I think there's going to be value to have these webinars so that those people who are dealing with it and have dealt with it. So for example, if you have a COVID case and how they managed and what they did in terms of disinfecting, what they did in terms of communicating to their stakeholders, I think it'll be important to move forward. So one of our plans is to continue these webinars on some regular basis, most probably on a monthly basis, and provide those updates through December. And then in terms of, there's a lot of questions, I think in the last one we had around some of the materials that you're gonna need, whether it's sanitizing material, whether it's plexiglass, those kind of things to start getting kind of retooling your facilities for the school year. We do have that also on the website where different groups you can go to and start ordering some of this stuff. I do implore you that if you're planning to do that, you need to get the order in now. We are already running into some issues. I think we've heard from our construction crews that we do have a problem with plexiglass right now. I know they can't find it even for new construction. So anything you can do to get ahead of the curve, order anything that you need, I think is important. And then again, you know, Dana and his team are available. We've kind of set that up as a resource for a lot of our school districts so that the facility people or any others can call them directly if there's specific questions. If you need them to go out there and take a look at your ventilation system to provide some additional insight and help you get these things ready, we're available to do that too. So with that, let me just maybe open it up now for Q&A and chat. So Aaron, if you can help us with those questions, and we'll direct them to the right people.
Sounds good. Morning, everyone. This is Erin Sorensen with ICS. We do have a few questions, and I'll do my best to direct these at the appropriate people. Chris and Fred, I know you mentioned this in the chat as well, but the question to you, Chris, is if your school has a low enrollment, such as only 10 students in a classroom, do you still need to reduce to 50%? In this instance, they're saying their whole school enrollment is 70 students and we have space to have all here.
So the calculation that was provided by the Department of Public Safety is building wide. So there are some districts that are gonna fall into that category. Some of the smaller districts that have larger buildings, or even some big districts have buildings that are being underutilized that possibly will fall into this. So I believe Fred answered it answered it very well as well, that it's hybrid model, but again, some of these buildings may actually be able to have all the kids in there at one time. And maybe we'll get more direction come the 27th or whenever Governor Walz provides further direction on that, because there is a little bit of a gray area we're finding in some of this.
Thanks, Chris. Another question we had, is there a site for the building calculator and max capacity forms and directions? We do have that linked in the PowerPoint, which we will post on our website here shortly this morning. So you can be able to look at that resource there. Pat, a question for you. If you have an older school building that does not have HVAC in all rooms, what do you recommend to use for airflow? We normally have opened windows and used fans to move air. However, I've read that fans are not the best options.
Yeah, I guess I can start with this one, and Neil or others may have perspectives as well. I would, you know, first things first, everything that we've been reading and seeing documented encourages districts to consider discontinuing use of spaces where mechanical ventilation does not exist. So, you know, that may not be able to happen here, but I would say first priority would be maximize the use of any other areas in the building that do have some form of mechanical ventilation. Two, I would say, I agree that fans are probably not the best, and as well as opening windows. So in the case of those rooms, if you have to use them, I guess I would put those into category 3, and I would try to figure out how to supplement with any kind of air purification or kind of standalone equipment that could be added to those spaces. Anyone else have a thought on that?
We've been exploring the same thought process as Pat's going through. I think it may be possible to do it at least during the early fall with respect to opening some windows up. But I would concur with respect to directional use of fans. You do not want to have that. You want to have good mixing, but you don't want to have any directional use on the fans. And if you are going to use a space, probably one of the safer approaches is to have a dilution via filtration or UVC lighting. And that might be your best option. And again, if you're going to do the filtration, has to be elevated off the floor.
Thanks, Pat and Neil. Neil, we have another question for you. Should hand dryers in bathrooms be eliminated? What about water drinking fountains? Should they be shut down?
We just dealt with that problem. In the dorms, we have some areas where we've got blowers, and the reason why we're keeping them in there is because the students will put the paper towels in the toilets and they will overflow. I don't know if you have that problem in schools, but that's an issue.
That's just colleges. That's colleges. That's not middle schoolers or elementary kids, right?
Fantastic. I didn't know that. So, but as a general rule, that having the air dryers really does do a very good job of aerosolizing the particles that are on the hands. So if you've got compliant enough students that understand where the toilet, the paper goes, I think that's a lot better if you can disable those. If you have to use it, then you're putting some people at risk. The second question was what?
What about water drinking fountains? Should they be shut down?
Our sanitarian's been looking at that issue. His name's Mark Rossi, and we're trying to disable, if you can disable the part where the drinking fountain is, but yet still enable the part where the water bottle dispenses water, I think you're going to be okay. In that case, doing that often requires a plumber to do the change. So then you have to think about if that's worth it. But right now we're trying to prevent people from using the drinking fountain portion and only using the bottle filler section.
Thanks, Neil. Those are all the questions that we had in the chat. I don't know if anyone else in this group has any other questions. Feel free to ask them at this time.
Okay. Any last words, Pat?
No, I would just, well, no, and then I'll continue talking, right? No, I would just say, take it step by step. Obviously, ventilation and how we treat infrastructure is just one piece of this puzzle, and utilize all the resources that you've got available.
Maybe because we have a few minutes, I do want to, if you get a chance, because I think we are going to see a lot of discussion going on right now across the U.S., but also in Minnesota, and there's some discussion with the governor in terms of the use of masks. I think that's extremely critical that the people on the call understand what we mean by that, why it's important. And I know Neil has been doing some significant research on masks as a part of that public health group at the University of Minnesota. So Neil, just give a quick overview on masks and what you found out and what you're recommending at this point.
Sure. The masks, at least all the data that we've gotten, there's some brand new information from the CDC, and the head of the CDC, and I sent that off yesterday. There's strong evidence that wearing masks helps prevent asymptomatic individuals who have the disease from transmitting it to other people. The downside with the cloth masks and some of the lower end masks, or face coverings as we can also call it, to differentiate it between surgical masks and respirators, is that they do not protect you very well at all. You're going to get a fit factor maybe about 2 or 3 at best with the commercially available ones. So if you have some individuals that really need to be protected, and in the other group we talked about it, individuals that have several different risk factors that they've identified through their disability services, then you need to really think about whether they should be in schools or how you accommodate them so that they can be in the presence of other individuals safely. I think if we were working through this and we had unlimited supply, I'd like to see an upgrade from the cloth masks to something more. Even the really lousy KN95 respirators that they're trying to sell us as N95s, they aren't good for N95s. They're about 10%. But that 10% is better than most cloth masks and most surgical masks. So that's at least somewhat of an upgrade.
Great, thank you, Neil.
Thanks, Neil. We do have a couple of additional questions, Arif. Can we go through those?
Yeah, please.
Okay. One question to probably Chris. With drinking fountains being a code requirement, are you allowed to shut them off completely?
Yeah, this one keeps coming up. I don't think we've gotten clear direction as to whether or not there's a stance from the state on that. But in terms of the guidelines, it's definitely leaning that way. And as Neil said, you know, if you've got the bottle fill option, that is preferred to be used, and just shutting off the drinking fountain portion. Maybe, you know, if you have one of those bottle fills somewhere in the building, maybe you shut everything down and you keep that. But possibly getting more direction coming in the following weeks on that, as well as to how the state's going to take a stance on that.
Thanks, Chris. There is a question in here that may be directed towards Fred. It's an occupancy question. If we are doing a 50% capacity and are rotating between on-site and distance learning, how are we tackling feeding both groups? There's a secondary question, Fred, but I'll just take it in that first chunk if that's okay.
Good question, Colin. And that's what will be addressed. One of the things we'll be addressing in the transportation breakout coming up in about a half hour. But we're recommending that you send the meals home on the buses, either with the students or without the students, and I'll explain the difference. And then you can have multiple meals delivered at the same time. If they go home with the student, we're recommending you use tubs in the front row of the bus that cannot be used for students, with a para, so that the para delivers the meals so kids don't eat the meals on the way home. Another option is some districts are taking an entire day that's all distance learning, and they're delivering the meals with the buses on that day for the entire week. And food service would have a lot of ideas of how to do this, whether the meals would actually be prepackaged or they just be the ingredients for the meals, et cetera. But great questions, Colin. These are the kinds of things everybody needs to think about.
Thanks, Fred. I think that's all the questions that we have for now. Arif, would you like to wrap us up?
Yeah, great, Aaron. Thank you for everyone for taking the time to present. One thing I forgot to mention is wanted to welcome Fred Nolan. We recently engaged Fred as a ICS consultant to help through this COVID issue that we're dealing with. So we'll have some additional resources as it relates to a pretty challenging time, I think, for all of us as we move this forward. So we wanted to make sure we have some of these experts with experience and knowledge around education also on the team to help throughout this school year. So again, thanks for everyone that's been involved in putting together. Thank you, Aaron. Erin Sorensen is our director of marketing for us. This is kind of become her night job because she has a normal job in terms of pulling together a lot of information. I do want to thank her and her team for really going over and beyond and dedicating a lot of their personal time to pull all this information together. So again, thank you, Erin. Thank you, everybody else, and take care. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.